Um, so some of you heard this last night. It's a little repetitious, but I just want to make sure because everybody deserves to kind of get the big picture. And really going to the next slide, I want to thank the people that have been on the CR Forum IT Roundtable Planning Committee. It's been really, rewarding to me to kind of see, the next generation kind of step up and say, I want to be part of this, and to come up with their own sessions, and, just reflecting a little bit how much the world has changed. So when we started this 20 years ago, we were like, should we have an EMR? Do we need a clinical trial management system? Are we ever going to find a way to be able to analyze the data? And, 20 years ago, we weren't sure we would have the data in anywhere to analyze it. And now we have it in multiple research data warehouses that we're trying to analyze it. So the world has definitely changed. And you can see the people on these slides, have really stepped up to do a lot of the planning. And I think that's very much appreciated. I just want to remind you again, in terms of the Clinical Research Forum, that this is, as an organization, is the group that we're very, focused on promoting the value of clinical research to the public and to particularly the government sponsors, right? So you'll see the top 10 comes out every year, and we were saying we got 85 applications this year for 10 slots. It's very important for us to continue to show the public and our congressional colleagues that clinical research is worth the investment. And I'd have to look and see, be interesting at one point to look at those top 10 awards and say, how many of them and in what ways did they benefit from clinical research informatics? And because I don't know that any of them are awarded based on what I would call a primary informatics exercise, but maybe. But anyhow, it would be interesting to look at that, and then we could get a better feeling for what our role is in the process. So I'm again very thankful for the planning committee and our sponsors. So both Epic and Trinetics have really been good partners with us, and we hope during the sessions that I know they'll contribute, and maybe we can more specifically, meet with them over the lunchtime. And with that, because I don't want to cut into the more of the time for the first panel, we'll move ahead. And Kim or anybody that thinks we need to describe anything about the IT platform, now's a good time, but let's get started.
Sure, and just letting everyone know, the chat is open. You can either chat on the platform or chat in the Zoom chat right here, whichever you prefer. You can always take yourself off of mute and put yourself on camera as well if you have any questions. But Dr. Ferris, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you, Dan and Kim. Good morning, everybody. Todd Ferris, CTO for Research Informatics here at Stanford. So we've got a great panel to kick this conference off. I'm really excited, and we've got quite action-packed. I think we maybe overstacked it to try and fit in the 1 hour here. So I'm going to hold the introductions to be pretty brief and let the panelists get going. Although I'm hoping that our first person, we may have to change up the order a little bit. So Claire, you might need to be ready to jump in. So I'll just quickly go through our first speaker. Hopefully will be Timothy Huerta, who's the CRIO at The Ohio State University. And then we'll be followed up by Claire from Datavant. And then Eric Feinstein from Leap Year, talk about some really interesting technology they have, both Datavant and Leap Year. And then Aaron Smith will be talking from Ohio State, some imaging de-identification work that they're doing there. And then we'll be closed out by Christopher Bartlett from the Research Institute at Nation Children's Hospital, talking about more of the legal aspects. So really interesting and looking forward to it. Let's see now. Kim, do you see if Timothy's joined yet? I know he was running a bit late.
He's running a few minutes late. We might need to change the order briefly.
He just sent an email saying that he can't find the link.
Yes, I just sent it to him.
Okay,
He's
great.
logging on shortly.
All right. Well, maybe we go ahead and change up the order a little bit. Claire, are you okay jumping in?
Yes, absolutely. Can you see my screen?
Looks great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and great to see so many faces I'm familiar with. I'm Claire Monet. I work with Datavant on the provider partnerships and innovations team within our public sector. I'm going to jump right into what Datavant does. Datavant's mission and goal is pretty hefty. It's to connect the world's health data, but we're starting with the US right now. I work primarily with our PCORNet academic medical centers and health systems and other linkage projects and collaboratives. And we understand that there's a need to connect disparate data sets. These data exist in separate EHRs. You see one instance of an EHR, it's one instance of it, and there's no interoperability amongst different ones. And so we provide the software to be able to link those together. But in addition to that, there are so many other different types of data sets that can help propel your research. It could be claims data from pharmacies and medical claims, social determinants of health data. And that gives you a big picture of what your patient's journey looks like. As I mentioned, I work very closely with our academic medical centers and health systems. So I live in this world right here, this little circle, but we do work with a lot of other data sources. We work with mortality data sources, which has been increasingly helpful for research, translational and clinical. And we are not a marketplace. We're an ecosystem that connects other parties to each other, and we merely provide the plumbing, if you will, the linkage, so that you can enhance your research needs. So let's get into the Datavant solution. And this is a small example. I know Dr. Huerta is going to go into it into more detail, but the project at hand is linking the Nationwide Children's Hospital EHR and the OSU Med Center's EHR together. They're currently in separate forms, and we're providing the link to them. And to give you a more illustrative example, you have John Smith, who was born this year at the OSU Med Center, but after the birth, the baby will be going to the Nationwide Children's Hospital. And so they start their journey at OSU, then will go to Nationwide Children's. And once they transition into adulthood, they will go back to OSU. This has been going on for decades now. And so I just used a more recent version, but we'll be able to do this historical linkage of being able to look at the patients at both institutions, both hospitals, and get a more complete picture of them. And what we do, the solution that can be done on-prem or it can be done through the cloud, is installing the software, the Datavant software behind the firewall. It tokenizes, I'll get into what tokenization means, but it tokenizes the patient's data so that it is going to be de-identified, and it will capture all of these other data elements such as ICD-9 and 10 codes, CPT codes, et cetera, and links it to the other data set at the other hospital. And that way you have one big spreadsheet, a CSV file, and it shows you all the connections, the matched patient with all of their appended data. And I know Dr. Huerta will get into what that's going to look like. But what's a token? A token is a hash string, a 44-character hash string that was developed by PHI data elements. The input data are usually first name, last name, gender, address, zip code, date of birth. It could be a phone number, an email address, social security number. We work with you to configure a template that will either remove or pass through certain elements. And it gives you the hash string token plus the output data and the appended elements that you're looking for: ICD-10 code, social determinants of health data, demographic data, etc. And when you are able to tokenize your data, you can also work with us in our platform so that you can see where the overlap is between your data set and another data set. And we have this available on our platform. When you register and sign on, you can see where the convergence of these Venn diagrams lies. So in this instance here, it could be looking at pharmacy and medical claims and perhaps a clinical trial, and you want to know where that convergence is. So we provide that. And I mentioned earlier, I work very closely with collaboratives. The collaboratives that I work with primarily are in this hub-spoke model, like PCORNet, like the Greater Plains Collaborative and PedsNet. And so they serve as a hub, and they have multiple sites contributing their data to the hub. And the hub will also submit the data directly to PCORNet, which is based at Duke. Other collaboratives that I work with also may enrich their data using other unique and novel linkages from other data sources. And then the last way is to license your data out to the ecosystem as well. And I'll stop right there. That's my presentation. And I hope Tim made it back.
I did. Sorry for being
Excellent.
late. I had
Great.
technical issues.
No worries. Glad you're back.
And I'm happy to take a step back. It's fun. It's great. It's great to see everybody here. In fact, what's even better for me is that there are names here that I actually recognize. So I'm so glad to see a whole bunch of you. I haven't been able to catch up with a lot of you lately. I hope to soon. So I'm just going here. Let's see if we can do this right. There we go. So we were going to talk about, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yep, looks great.
So we were going to talk about privacy preserving analytics. And the fact of the matter is that there are these data warehouses that exist, and data warehousing isn't new for research. Like we know they exist, we're out there, we know that they're there. OSU's history around its own data warehouse has been effectively, we leverage Epic's data warehouse. Whenever we need data for a clinical study, we have analysts who pull data out of Caboodle or Clarity and deliver that data on a concierge-based service to the researcher under a requisite IRB. But if you're a researcher, there's a lot of, and you're, particularly if you're interested in secondary data analysis, or more broadly, you're interested in advanced analytics like AI, ML, those kinds of things, asking for that data becomes problematic, right? You've got just the sheer volume of data necessary to kind of glean that and train that, train those tools becomes significant. And so the question becomes, how do we safely engage with people in that way? And so we began talking about what an ideal solution would be. We share our CCTS, our Center for Clinical and Translational Science, is an NCATS CTSA that includes both Nationwide Children's and Ohio State University. So we operate as a partnered CTSA in the context of that research environment. But we are still separate HIPAA entities with multiple organizational delivery agents, some of which are in Epic, some of which are not in Epic. For example, our cancer registry with the state of Ohio is submitted through Oncolog. Our dentistry data is not on Epic. Our optometry data is not on Epic. The College of Public Health has social determinants of health that have not been integrated into Epic. And while I may have that data at OSU, I may want to also map that data to the individuals at both organizations. So for example, I might want census tract-based data. The state of Ohio publishes a children's opportunity index and an adult opportunity index, which are area-based deprivation indices that are basically structural social determinants of health. And we might want to, at the individual level, map that to the kind of holistic medical record, so that we have some context from a social determinants of health if we were doing analytics in that environment. And so having a shared data set could be transformative for the kind of thing that we're doing, in particular when we're linking not just Mary at OSU to Mary at NCH, but Mary, who's the mother of John, who was born at OSU, who's then been seen as John at NCH. We want to maintain family linkage, while at the same, and in particular, we're focusing right now on mother-child linkage in our data set, and continue to respect that, so that as we're analyzing the data, we can look at linkages in family. And then probably the biggest barrier to all of this is we want to make this final data set available under a single pre-approved IRB. A lot of organizations will build data warehouses, and then every researcher has to go and submit an IRB to request data from that resource. And so the question becomes, could we architect a solution that would allow us to effectively give researchers free and unfettered access to the data? Under what circumstances might that exist? And so privacy preserving linkage is critical to this process, right? I'm going to need to preserve the privacy of individuals if I'm not getting their HIPAA authorization. And there was no way I was going to get just a general HIPAA waiver for everybody from our IRB. That was just not going to be for any use whatsoever. Additionally, we have other kinds of data. A good example of that is we have imaging data. So part of this is we want to include imaging data linked to our clinical data for researchers to use. And if you look at the cost associated with de-identifying images, we spend something like we charge people $35 an image to de-identify. So if you think about de-identification at scale, and you think I need 50,000 images to do this with, going through and manually de-identifying every single image is just not realistic. And so we were talking about ideal end states and said, well, could we come up with a de-identification model that basically worked at scale? And so that was another ideal that we had. The goal being to create what we call Lifescale, which is really, the literature has Lifescale, uses the term Lifescale to talk about lifespan linked data that collects disparate health domains over time to form a 360-degree view of the patient. These kinds of data sources are the goal of organizations like ARC to understand the broader context in which people are receiving their care and potential factors that might influence those outcomes. And so we began engaging with our technology partner, Microsoft, about how we might stage the creation of a data lake that would hold all of this data, that would start in phase one with our basic Lifescale data, that would increase our ability to present this to IT teams through an analytic workbench, so that they have access to data at the individual level, not at the aggregated level. That would allow us to do things like eventually scalable genomics and predictive analytics, build models that are grounded closer into the clinical data mart as it exists, and then feed that back in through what Gartner talks about is the AI/ML kind of interactive process moving forward. So when I talk about the analytics workspace, what I'm talking about is the creation of a shared collaborative workspace across NCH and OSU that's built in Azure and on a foundation of Azure, where users can leverage lots of technologies to ask questions to the shared data set that is inclusive of all of this other data. And so what you see here is our current kind of model of the architecture. And I'm going to zoom into this so you don't have to kind of see very, very clearly into this right now. But At the top side here, you have OSU's data. At the bottom side here, you have NCH's data. And this gold area here is our ideal, which is a merged data set that has it all. So if I break that down, the way that we've instantiated this is we have on-prem data from Epic, data from the Comprehensive Cancer Center, lots of other data. And we are moving all of that data as a first step into Azure. So that's our first step. And then we are selecting and identifying identifiers across all of these data sets. Sometimes they're the MRN, sometimes it's I don't know, address, zip code, it's the standard PHI identifiers. And what we're doing is creating a master identifier table at each of our organizations. We're going to be sending just the identifier table, not the data, not the other PHI, not the clinical data, to Datavant. And so what you heard Claire talk about was Datavant's technologies that would allow us to then create a linkage process that is multi-level, that would allow us to go to create a hashed linked master identifier table that would have a way for us to link back to link our organization's data together. We would take that identifier table, integrate it right back into our data, and then run a transfer script monthly that would effectively drop the PII identifiers, rehash the identifiers on ingress with a common randomly generated salt, and then remove data on our part, for example, from partner sites that hadn't given us permission to use their data for research. OSU runs a Community Connect program, and so we don't include Community Connect data in that process. So into this data set that now meets or is intended to meet the requirements for a coded limited data set under HIPAA. So when this process is done, we have a coded limited set. We are including dates, we're including zip codes, the standard requisite components. But what we have done in the back end, for example, is geocode all of our data, find the census tract for all of our data, and pre-linked that data to social determinants of health data. So what you end up with is a shared database that has an architecture that includes lots of other data beyond the clinical data, right? Beyond what you would find, for example, in our Epic record. And then we are experimenting with putting a differential privacy filter on top of that, which Eric Feinstein is going to talk about in a bit, and delivering that to the researcher. So that's kind of where it's broken down. And today, the speakers are actually broken down in different areas. Like Claire spoke a little bit about Datavant's role. The other speakers today are going to talk about their kind of places within the context of this architecture. But that's kind of the big picture. We're seeking an IRB from our approval from our I'm talking too fast. We're seeking approval from our IRB to allow researchers to, under a single IRB, to allow researchers to access this coded limited data set by signing a data use agreement and agreeing to go through training that we have agreed to together. This isn't just a technological problem, as you all likely guess. This is really a governance problem of making all this work. And it's been a significant challenge, but we continue to kind of work forward on making all that happen. So I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to move on to the next person, which would be Chris, if you're available.
Tim, before you switch off, we do have one question in the chat. Sure. Jeremy asked just about the reason that you're using Caboodle. Just mainly, is it because it's been normalized? Is that why you chose to? So
imagine you're a researcher trying to do implementation science, and you want to go to a hospital and say, I've built AI tools that allow you to reduce sepsis or whatever, pick what you want. What would you rather have? Someone who's normalized, what would you rather have them build that on? The normalized data of Caboodle that exists, right? Or some translation of that data that someone has to then then manipulate, and potentially there are sources of error there. We believe that because of the normalization of Caboodle, that we can reduce the kind of knowledge to practice gap by leveraging data that is closer to what is actually being used in operations. And so the idea of getting as close to an operations data set as possible is where we stand with this. The closer we can get to what operations really looks like, the faster then, if I can establish that it works in our operations data set, the fact of the matter is our organization will be far more likely to accept that model as a high quality model because it was done on their data. It was done on data that's in their structure. And if you want to generalize that, it's now generalizable. So my answer, Jeremy, is yes.
Excellent. And we have two additional questions that popped in kind of around the census tract info, one from Phil and then another one from Matt. Do you want to take a look at those?
Sure. So we're matching to census tract, and we're using structural social determinants of health. There are some social determinants of health data that might be collected inside of EPIC. And to the extent that they exist in Caboodle, they're there. But what we are trying to basically do is integrate what is known as the Phoenix Toolkit into our, focusing primarily on the structural social determinants of health into our data set, so that our researchers can then begin to explore on, basically standards-based approaches to these kinds of things, right? Without having to do the linkage themselves. And I think another part of this is that, let's say you found something in this system. Our expectation is that if you found something, the next step would be for you to validate, which at that point you would submit an IRB and you would ask for the variables you knew you needed, right? And as a result, it changes the way the IRB authoring process happens, because you're doing this from a sense of knowledge relative to what you need to ask for, as opposed to broad requests to the IRB that may be, I'm not quite certain what I need this general kind of thing. And then you're negotiating with an analyst to identify what is in EPIC to help them pull that out, or what is in the social determinants of health data to pull that out. For census, are you persisting the census characteristics? So our intent is to find the census tract for that, map on the social determinants of health for those census tracts, delete the census tract, but also we intend to round on the census tract, on the social determinants of data, to make it less likely that individuals can be identified relative to like you can't go and reverse engineer stuff. Now, could you conceivably do it? You absolutely could conceivably do it, right? But the dynamic is we give people coded limited data sets all the time with that requirement, thou shalt not. And so when I said that the hardest part of this was governance, what I mean is that there's an incredible amount of trust that has to be built in order for these kinds of systems to work. And because we have a shared CCTS, this is something that we've been building over years of engagement. So my intention is that the data, the social determinants data would be there, but the census tract reference wouldn't. So you wouldn't know what census tract they were in. You wouldn't know their zip code. I'll stop there. I answered all the questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Chris, do you want to go?
I can go next, but Todd, I think you had a different order in mind.
Oh, sorry.
I think we had planned to jump over to Eric to talk a little bit about what leap year was doing in the original order, but
yeah,
we can switch it up.
Yeah.
Happy to do it. So hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So my name is Eric Feinstein. I am the VP of Customer Success here at Leap Year. I've spent my time in my career really focusing on giving access to data to those who need it, right? To drive whatever goals or outcomes they want for their business or organization. And Leap Year is really, it's an interesting angle on that. At Leap Year, we're really trying to focus ourselves on the data sets that are the most sensitive and are sort of blocked from access for one of many reasons. It could be regulatory, it could be internal, it could be reputation, right? So folks are not always going to be freely using or allowing for use of different data sets because of those reasons, right? So Leap Year is a product and a platform that really allows for the use of that data, either for just simply, analyzing, for sharing, or even selling for different uses. So we are found in the top healthcare companies in the US. We're found in top banks actually around the world. We are found anywhere that there is really sensitive data, and that typically finds itself in health and financial transactions. And we are based on a lot of academia. So there is a number of patents and papers related to our platform. That being said, right, healthcare is where we're focusing for this project, obviously. And we know that this data is incredibly sort of valuable, right? The more information you have about patients across their life and their journey, the more you can really analyze and provide better outcomes. But we also know that there is a significant amount of kind of risk in the patient privacy. And we want to protect those patients first and foremost, but at the same time, we are now in this trade-off of how do we protect their privacy and use their information to drive the best outcomes for everybody. So we know that, there is a significant amount of importance in this topic. We have lots of methods that we can use, right, to de-identify data, but we also know that this sort of hinders the analytic value of that data set, right? So the more we kind of remove information, the less signal we get from the data set. That's where Leap Year really focuses, right? So we want to be able to provide a system that allows for the best use of that data without having to kind of lose value. So here's a simple example of what this could look like, right? So we have a question that an analyst wants to ask. They want to ask really about adverse effects of a drug. I've learned not to ever try to pronounce any drug names. So they have a question about a drug. They'd like to understand, which patients are most likely to have adverse effects. Really, any question that an analyst might have about patients, right? So we have a lot of data sets, right? And every time we want to analyze a data set, I think to Tim's point, right, we have to go through a process of de-identifying that data, certifying it, analyzing it. And we tend to see that it becomes a bit more aggregated, but we can answer the question. We can say something like patients between 25 and 40 have the most adverse effects. We can take different data sets. So let's say data set number 1 is NCH, data set number 2 is OSU. We can certainly analyze those independently. They require their own processing and data prep. Or we can try to combine them, right? And that also requires, repeating the process. So every time we want to add data sets, we might have to kind of revisit the data prep. But we still end up with, an answer at an aggregate level. What Leap Year's platform allows for folks to do is, instead of just simply, analyzing data sets independently, is that we can actually certify the platform, and the platform provides the level of privacy that we want to have by the same kind of process that we were following across whatever data sets you put through it, right? So to Claire's points earlier, right, if we can link those data sets, we can keep adding more and more data to the consortium, and then we can use a platform like Leap Year to run all of our analysis, right? It doesn't, Leap Year allows for the analyst to really analyze the raw data without ever really seeing it. They can run models, they can run statistics, they can get really granular insights, but the platform itself protects the privacy of those individuals. So the results are always going to be private and compliant, whereas it doesn't require its own process for every single question you have. So we can get much more granular information, we can get more demographics, we can get more detail in the analysis without having to go through this process over and over again, or reduce the signal because we're de-identifying and removing information. So really, where does the platform sit? What does it do? It sits between the analyst and the data. So instead of the data having to be modified to the point that it's private, we can leave the data as is. And we allow those analysts to use our platform, which will track what they do. It will ensure that the results are private. It will ensure that a number of attacks on that data or protecting those patients exists, right? So that you cannot really identify the patients, but you can do all the analysis that you'd like to without having to start the process again from the start. So we are, we enable statistics, we enable models, like you can train models with all of the data instead of just the aggregated or de-identified data. And that really allows you to leverage this data for its true value. I did see a question, but I will pause at the end for it. So, for LifeScale specifically, right, we are working with the team here to put in a way that they can use the linkage between the organizations and really any organizations, right? We can keep adding more and more data to this in the future if we had it, and then connect the analyst with that, right? It really allows the data to be prepped one time. It doesn't require the loss of sort of signal, and those analysts can do whatever they need to do to make the best models for the best outcomes without having to reduce the effectiveness of what they're studying. So in summary, right, we provide a system, right, and there's some more technical details that I'm happy to get into based on questions, but the data doesn't really ever have to leave the environment. You don't need to send data to someone else to analyze. You can analyze it where it sits, and then Leap Year will provide the privacy layer on top of that. We created an environment where the analyst never really needs to see all of the row level data. If you're generating models, we employ a number of techniques, including something like differential privacy, to ensure that the output is accurate. It has a high utility, but it is private. So we can really allow those analysts to create whatever sort of insights they need while protecting those individuals. So I'll pause for, there was a question, I think, in the chat.
Yeah, Eric, that was great. The question was really about what level of the identification is happening during the process. Does this meet, limited data set? Is it actually to the point of safe harbor? What is the DID?
I'll let, I think, Tim or team answer that. From the Leap Year perspective, right, our platform allows for, the limited, like, you don't need to de-identify the data as much as, you might normally, because we are providing a layer of privacy on top of that. But I'll let the team speak to the current process.
Yeah, so in terms of our use of Leap Year, we're at this point experimenting with using Leap Year on the resultant data set. The resultant data set is a coded limited data set. So even if we had a privacy issue with regards to that, we'd be there's an additional layer of protection. These are at first we thought of honest brokerage and privacy preserving like along the lines of Leap Year alternatives, but we are exploring the fact that they may actually work together to create safer environments, so that even in the case where I'll use the social determinants of health question, I have these social determinants of health data, and I might be able to reverse engineer, the concern around reverse engineering data by looking things up in tables and trying to figure out where they were, because of privacy preserving differential privacy. I keep getting differential privacy and privacy preserving linkage mixed up in my head. Because of this differential privacy approach, and that you don't get individual row level data access, you wouldn't, in that environment, you wouldn't even get to see what that person's social determinant of health result was. And it makes it all that much harder to back that out. There are other tools like this called Smart Noise. That's another tool that's out there that is in the open source. The reason we went with Leap Year was we wanted a much more mature system to be able to experiment on questions related to what kind of protections does that put for our system, because we have to get our legal and we get this in the literature and get our legal systems comfortable with these models, right? They just take these things on their on kind of like your word of honor that this is what happens. The more that we can show them, the more history we can give them, the better off they'll be with regards to this level of access relative to a research data source that is as broad as this.
Great, thanks for that. And then Eric, there's one additional question. Do typically your data sources, do you do some like a BAA with them?
Well, thinking about the technical implementation of the product, right? We are deployed on premise into, in this example, OSU's environment. So we as a vendor never need to see the data. So, the only kind of BAs would be in between other parties. Not that that's impossible, but we are, we're deployed on premise such that, we are part of the environment that OSU is setting up.
Great, thank you. All right, well, to stay on time, we should move to our next speaker. And I think we're switching things up a little bit. And Chris is gonna talk a little bit more about the legal aspects, given all the sort of questions.
All right, so let me get this going. Okay, so this switching gears. The tech components are critical with a capital C and important with a capital I. If that doesn't exist, then none of this works. That's 100% true. However, I just wanted to bring in the other dimension to this, the soft skills. Tim and I spent a fair amount of our days talking about tech issues, but we also spent a fair amount of our days talking about legal issues and just strategic alliances in general. And so real quick, because I didn't want to take up too much time from questions, I wanted to walk us backwards a little bit. This is a group, you all know that the ACA was not the beginning of electronic healthcare records, but that's not necessarily general knowledge. But what was neat about the ACA is population health was baked into its DNA. Also, the HITECH Act, the meaningful use and these sorts of things was also baked into the ACA's DNA as well. And so the concept of using electronic health records, sharing data, doing population level work was certainly a big part of all of this. I'm going to get back to HITECH in a second, but of course, HIPAA from a legal point of view, this is driving a lot. But what I wanted to talk about from an alliance point of view was actually where HITECH really began, which was not under the Obama administration, it was actually under the George Bush administration. And the Secretary for Health and Human Services did a lot of work on how do you wrangle all these cats together to make this more of a reality, get it to be less of the Wild West and a little bit more tameable. And what he did was he wrote a book a few years ago talking about strategic alliances, but this is an interesting book for us as a group because his experience working with getting the EHR industry sort of a little bit more in some kind of a common direction, building up those alliances, he has that experience and he writes a lot about that in this book. So I thought it was great. We definitely don't have time to go over this in any detail, but just a few high points. It's everyone's self-interest to fix a common pain. And so his argument is that really nothing's going to happen unless there is a common pain. OSU and NCH have that. We're both research institutions. We want to do more. We want to be more competitive with grants. We want to do better with helping patients and getting generalized knowledge. That's a common pain. So we're already on the same page with a lot of things. The hospital down the street that doesn't do research, that would be a very different proposition and potentially an impossible problem because you may not have a common pain with another institution. And so I would agree with this assessment. And again, he gives examples based on the EHR work that he was doing years ago. We have to get the right people around the table. It's obvious that we need leaders and the right tech representatives and the right patient advocates around the table, but having a visionary, somebody who can really get people interested in moving forward on this, that's also a very important thing. And so that's a role that sometimes Tim plays, sometimes the PI of our CCTS grant plays. It moves a little bit in a project big and complicated like this, but we definitely have people who are, inspiring others to come to the table, and then we make sure that we have the right people around the table. And so Tim and I spend a fair amount of our time brainstorming and working with people. Well, who else should we get in this conversation? Who's the next link that we need to talk to? I think the legal aspect of things comes with what Leavitt calls a formal charter, right? He says a group has to have some kind of a mission that's formalized in some way. And for us, HIPAA winds up driving almost all of those conversations. Our charter is based upon, let's keep this legal, let's find a HIPAA basis, let's work with the privacy board and make sure that patients are protected 100%, even above and beyond what's legally required. You were talking about using leap year, for example, to add even more privacy on top of the limited coded data set. And so this is something that just winds up being part of that conversation. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and if you take legal advice from me, may God have mercy on your soul. But I do spend a fair amount of time talking to lawyers, and we can maybe field some general sort of stuff with that. Lastly, we have to always maintain a well-defined common ground. And so OSU and NCH, because we've worked together collaboratively for many years, we have some of that already built in, but it's still very important for us to constantly redefine what that common ground is. Many of our conversations seem to go around, not quite in circles, but they take these indirect paths because we're still trying to feel out exactly how can we make sure that we are doing what we're both intending without stepping on each other's feet. So it's actually a fair amount of work to do this data sharing because of not just the legal framework. That's there for good reasons with good intent, but also just organizational reasons. We're not the same organization. We have slightly different goals. And so I just wanted to discuss this, and we can bring this up in the discussion a little bit because I think the tech end of this is covered extremely well with all the other panelists. So I was just gonna end it there and cede control back to Todd.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. That was excellent. Let's see. I think you did such a good job. We don't have any questions for you right away. I think we'll save them for when we get into the panel discussion. So then I think we'll round things out with Aaron talking a little bit more about image de-identification.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Let me just get myself sharing here. All right. I really don't have that many slides to share. Just wanted to give a little more detail on the background and the process we've used to evaluate the different systems that we've started testing. So pragmatically, what we're trying to do is to make sure that when we go to release data for research purposes, all of the metadata and the pixel data is scrubbed appropriately. There are manual processes like Dr. Huerta mentioned that are currently used to do that, but we're trying to scale up. So ultimately, we've taken 2 different vendors and put them through their paces, evaluating about 13 different imaging modalities. We've evaluated how they do and the kinds of different PHI I guess leakage or data that remains in the images or in the metadata once the procedures have been run on them. And we're in the process now of concluding our evaluation and producing recommendations for what the next step of this evaluation will look like. So the short form, just a little bit of insight is just we've found different vendors have kind of a different focus, applied artificial intelligence and different approaches with a focus, some focus on the imaging, the pixel data, and others focus on filtering through the metadata more and are more effective at that. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. There's a lot of interesting possibilities here. My background is in data science, and so doing machine learning on large imaging data sets is something that's kind of I'm passionate about, and I'd like to get to the point where we can support, and that's really the end goal here. So I'll just leave it at that and try to give a little bit more time for open discussion. Tim, if there's anything else you'd like to add, I'd be happy to backfill with any questions that arise.
So Aaron, actually, I have one quick question. One of the things we've struggled with image de-identification is machine specific. So we often have, this GE by this model tends to burn in, patient name here. Are you guys finding that as well?
Certainly. And while there are other SMEs that have a depth of knowledge in terms of the manual process, I've been brought into this to kind of look at the AI side as well. So certainly, and a lot of the vendors end up making very device specific essentially filters that will know approximately where, in terms of the pixel location, to be looking for specific data. And we are providing feedback to the vendors as well that allow them to refine those device specific essentially filters, right? Yeah.
The other thing we see is the DICOM specification is such that, well, we've seen things put into weird places, just even in the headers. I think everyone has seen this. Have you been able to leverage your AI techniques to pick up that, oh, look, someone stuck a name in the comment field or something like that?
Yeah, so the unexpected is probably one of the biggest challenges. But yes, there are kind of general pattern matching approaches that are being used to look for specific kinds of character sequences and so forth wherever they might appear, both in the metadata and the pixel data. So yes, and I think that there are some pretty good results there, but we're not anywhere near 100%, and that I think is probably the biggest challenge with the automated and machine-based approaches to this problem, right? Is that you have to decide at what level you're going to have the human who can actually catch all of the finer details or those surprises, bring that final layer of vetting or validation. So yeah, certainly still a problem.
Absolutely. That is, we could have a whole panel talking about what is de-identified, at what level is enough. So excellent. Thank you so much. All right. Well, I think we should maybe if you could stop sharing, Aaron, and then we can get kind of the bigger view and we can see what sort of questions and move into the more discussion phase. Yeah, if you just pop up to the top, there we go. All right. Excellent. Well, I may take the moderator's prerogative and kick off the first question, and maybe see if we can get things rolling. So I think this will be more for Timothy and Chris. I guess one of the things, reflecting to our journey in this space, we ultimately decided to create a second copy of our data set that's completely de-identified so that we could allow our researchers to approach it, IRB-less. And that's where they go to kind of do that first initial pass and then decide, is it worth it? Do they need to go get an IRB and then go on there? But you guys chose to go the limited data set route. And I'm just kind of curious what was pushing you in that way and why you went that path.
I can speak to that a little bit. I think one of the reasons why we wanted to do that was to preserve dates, right? So if you think about, let's say you're interested in COVID, the ability to include dates becomes critical. And so the real reason we just decided that was what we wanted was all around the desire to not have to shift dates.
Excellent.
The question
Thank you.
is
That makes a lot of
intended to
sense.
be thrown out to the whole group, but I'd say that was certainly a consideration for UAV. The other is that even if it is really fully de-identified, even if you do date shifting, even if you do other things, when you're putting out a full spectrum of clinical data on a full population of your health system, there is risk of re-identification. There is risk of inappropriate use, even if it is, there's risk of sensitive information being distributed. So I think even if you have it de-identified completely, that doesn't mean it's without risk. So it is better to have those agreements and data use agreements, acknowledgements. We make sure people are IRB trained, HIPAA trained and sign an acknowledgement of restrictions on the use of limited data sets. So they can pull any data that they want, self-service, but they have signed on the dotted line that they acknowledge that what they should and shouldn't do with this LDS data. And we would want them from a legal best practice or at least a conservative position to say all those same things, even if it was completely de-identified.
Excellent. Thank you for those responses. Dan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I know, you know, we all deal with the institutional leaders and what they think are risks. It's amazing how little there is real data on cases. It's a little theoretical. I mean, it's real and I understand it, you know, at one level. I'm just trying to think, is there anything new to it? And I do think there's two differences. One is around PHI and re-identification. The other is kind of more institutional risk of reputational risk, right? That they are, you know, somehow a publication, you know, comes out, which is, you know, that's a different, in my view, that's kind of a different process to manage that. But they both kind of get in there sometimes, and it'd be nice to, you know, just to get your view on, is there someone, and then this thing, is indemnification really going to, is that going to relieve their concerns that all of a sudden they're more willing to share?
Chris, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I would say you're right on point. There's different levels of concern for different reasons. And you know, a children's hospital especially is very protective of its brand and does not want to have to send certain kinds of letters out to their families. And so that's definitely a concern that's maybe partially legal, but actually it's more reputational, as you point out. So that's a big deal. And no one likes those letters, but children's hospitals, I think, are a little more averse to that. The indemnification issue, I think that is a big part of it. Whatever the risk is, the idea is just, you know, can we work with somebody who we think is going to do the right thing, and if something goes wrong, you know, who's sort of handling that, and what are the steps they need to remedy that. So I think that is a big deal. But ultimately, what's nice about what we're doing here is with the limited coded data set, we're being careful about who's getting access. The risk is we're trying to minimize it at every possible step. And so what the worst case scenario turns out to be not that bad. We're not just sharing full PHI, full EHRs, or all that. And that's an important part of this. I think it'd be a non-starter if we tried to do more than what we're currently doing.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any way to start doing a better job at quantitating the risks, but they do become kind of theoretical discussions. I mean, the other one that, you know, frankly, you know, living in PCORNet and CTSA and other things, I mean, I've been quite impressed how well we've been able to keep research use of data away from business use of data. You know, that I mean, maybe they're out there, and, you know, sometimes it's helped. We're probably a group that is as informed as others that would say, can you give examples where a data sharing amongst institutions was set up for research purposes and was somehow misappropriated and turned into a business intelligence issue? Because I can think of lots of times where we could have done that, but we've been really good at keeping that firewall. And I don't know if there's those instances.
I'd also add, one of the other dynamics at play here is prior to April of this year, we treated all health-derived research data as PHI. And in April, we finally got a policy that instantiated a new classification of data at Ohio State called RHI, Research Health Information. And And that has had follow-on effects in terms of institutional risk and governance that have been incredibly positive. In part, this has been derived from an argument grounded in the legal frameworks that govern breaches of data. When you breach PHI, you report to OCR. When you breach research data at OSU, you report to a committee called DIRT. And the idea that and it is subject to the common rule, not HIPAA, unless you have no policy that says it's not PHI. And so before this process began, we began a process of talking to our legal environment, our legal people, about clarifying what research data was from a regulatory perspective. And I think that has enabled a conversation that would have not been possible otherwise. It also allowed us to bring in evidence. I sit on our HIPAA breach committee, where we've looked at where the breaches are, and they are generally not from research. And so talking about relative risk, the risk of running a clinical operation with regards to HIPAA is much higher than the risk of running a research operation out of HIPAA. There are risks, but those risks have not historically manifested themselves in actual negative outcomes. And I think in the face of the data, in the face of the legal frameworks, in the face of the kind of collaborative conversations around all of these things, OSU has over the last 2 years effectively been maturing its understanding of how research data may not be clinical data. There are some cases where research data is clinical data, fair enough. But when data is transferred under an IRB from a clinical environment to something else, it is no longer clinical data. It is now research data. And we actually have flow charts, and like if y'all need to talk about that, we've been working on writing an article about our journey to instantiate research health information across our institution. And so I'm hoping to get that out sometime soon. But yeah, that has actually been a really positive engagement with the institution.
And then
Peter, I'm sorry, just a quick comment to just jump on what you said, Tim. We do exactly the same thing. Is we pull the clinical data out with an IRB and then store it in the researcher data repository under that IRB umbrella. So it is no longer HIPAA covered data, which reduces the liability risk dramatically. We've had 2 problems with that. I mean, it works great. That's what we still do, but we have 2 problems with it. One is actually convincing the compliance people that that's true, that it's no longer HIPAA covered data, because not everyone is that familiar with the ins and outs of it. And the other thing is it doesn't do anything really to mitigate the reputational risk problem. So that if it gets out, it gets out, and nobody really wants their institutional name on the front page of the newspaper.
Yeah, that ties into Mark's question. So I was thinking about data collected prospectively for the purpose of research, and I was thinking data collected by a HIPAA covered entity. That is I can see a justification for that being research related, but you're talking about consumption designation, not collection designation. And it seems to me that there would be risk of, regardless of whence the institution said, if a HIPAA covered entity collected data in the process of treating patients, that even though that had been thrown across a wall to a research process, whether we think that is HIPAA covered data doesn't really matter.
So one of the things that informed this was we had the Office of Civil Rights at OSU. And this question was directly posed to them. And they said, once the data is handed over under an IRB, it is now research data. Like, it wasn't just us saying this, it was the Office of Civil Rights who was present at OSU during our HIPAA retreat saying this. And it was I remember the kind of almost audible gasp from the compliance people.
Yeah, I started getting a little twitchy when I heard it just now. But
again, different legal frameworks, right? The common rule governs that data. It doesn't. It's use
the common rule governs that data. Does that mean that the common rule governs that data to the exclusion of HIPAA?
So
Yes.
long as you have a policy.
Yeah,
This
our
is the-
feeling is, our feeling is yes. You need a waiver of consent and a waiver of authorization, but yeah, it moves into a different legal framework. But again, the problem is exactly, Matt, what you're saying is that that's great for us to say, and it's terrific that they had the backup of OCR, but we've sometimes had an uphill battle convincing various compliance people that this really works.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, I'm all for it.
And to be honest, that audible gas came from the compliance people, right? Who constantly use OCR as the means through which to say, no, can't do that, right?
Right.
And when OCR said, nope.
When that sort of thing gets to legal counsel, I mean, I've had situations where I am allowed to make the determination of what is reasonable, what is de-identified, what is acceptable under HIPAA limited data set. I have gone all the way through these processes and we are fine, no problem. For some completely different reason, this activity gets to the desk of legal counsel and it doesn't matter that we're fine. We are now going to do something different in addition, just in case. We're going to treat it like it's not anyway, just because.
Yeah, some of this I think is what I mentioned in the chat, at least again, my experience is that, legal counsel doesn't, what's their job? Their job is to minimize risk. So the way you minimize risk, you say, no, you can't use the data that way. So first we have to phrase the question differently and say, what's the lowest level risk? What's the way we can minimize risk? We're going to do this. How do we do it in a way that minimizes risk? That's a different question than can we do it? But sometimes you're not in a position to ask it that way. And so sometimes you have to kind of go the other way with the business and say, if this is really important to do, and here's why it makes a business case to do it. And then the business owners can go to legal counsel and say, we got to find a way to do this and put some pressure on them then. But it's very, again, for me, it's very institutional and sometimes even individual legal counsel specific on how best to approach it. It's a lot of friction to get it done.
I can see this being an attractive designation from a HIPAA privacy officer perspective. And if there's anyone who has almost as much say or more say than legal counsel, it is the HIPAA privacy officer.
Yep. So our HIPAA privacy, it happened that at that meeting, our HIPAA privacy officer and legal were both present, right? So again, I can tell them till I'm blue in the face, right? And it was really showing them frameworks and getting external agents to agree.
Well, I think this gets back to, Chris's point again, is there common pain? And from, as Peter mentioned, from legal's group, there is no common pain because if I say no, I will have been doing my job, right? And you really have to change that point of view. And it happens really at the very top of the organizational leadership to general counsel that, your job is to minimize risk and still allow us to go with our mission. It's not to minimize risk at all costs. So to the extent that organizational leaders make it clear that research and discovery is part of that mission, it puts the decision in a different framework. But sometimes it doesn't happen that way. It becomes, do another type of research. I believe, we do discovery, but try another type because in our, as the legal counsel, from my perspective, the best approach is to just not allow that type of research.
No in-house legal counsel or security officer ever got fired for saying no.
Well, I do think, that's why I was going back to say, are we starting to create this database of the reality? How many times has it happened? How many times has there really been, a reputational risk issue? How could it have happened? Because when you don't create that database of real experience, and I'm not going to say, because remember, I ran our IRB for a long time, and people say, well, no one gets sued for it. And I'm saying, you don't know how many cases are settled before it ever becomes a case. So the experience that everybody has about, what is the, what is the legal risk associated with clinical research is not easily known. And I understand, but until you start really trying to put some of this on the table, the general counsels can't make a good decision either, even if they're trying to, even if they believe, I have to balance risk benefits for the organization.
Can I ask an additional question? So
Sure, we're
this
a bit
applies
over,
to,
but maybe we call this the last
maybe
one.
very short.
And we should probably,
So that designation can happen for things that are covered by an IRB protocol. Can it also be a designation for things that are IRB exempt, LDS, secondary data analysis?
So technically, we're having conversations with our IRB right now. Like if it's de-identified, the IRB will write me a letter that says that this is not human subjects research and therefore not subject to a review by the IRB. Because the coded limited data set is technically holds PHI, it holds elements of PHI. We are writing this into our protocol and we're saying it's not de-identified data, right? So we are asking explicitly for a waiver of HIPAA authorization, a waiver of consent, under the conditions of basically describing what we're doing, which is why it falls into our framework. In both cases, it would still be RHI. It would be data derived from or about a patient's health. Where we've been having interesting conversations at the university is like, if the business school asks you if you have AIDS because they're interested in doing a study there, that's not held by a HIPAA covered entity, but it's still health information. And you can look at psychology, you can look at business. There are other areas of the university that have been gathering health data or health related data about individuals and haven't had similar processes. So we've effectively established that all that data needs to be held in an S4 classification, that it needs to be held under our most secure form of data storage and access controls and the like, which is the other part that links to RHI. One of the things that we made note was PHI is S4 data under our ISCRs. It's RHI is S4 data, right? We're not saying that we're reducing the security with which the data is being held. And that was also another important component.
This has been a great discussion. And Timothy, I'm going to urge you to publish that because I want to be able to bring that to my compliance folks. So get to writing. So this has been great. I really appreciate everybody's chiming in and the panelists. Thank you for your time. And I'm going to turn this back to Kim and Andrea.
Yes, Kim has gone to the other room to get us set up for our 11:30 session. So I hope everyone's able to head over there. If the speakers are okay, we would love to be able to post your presentations on the platform. If you haven't already sent them to Kim, please do so. And thank you for a great panel. I want to acknowledge Todd and his leadership with this panel. Thank you so much. And great conversation. So we'll see you at the next session.
So should we say for everybody 10:35? Okay, so we ran over a little bit, so we'll rejoin the new session at 10:35. And thanks again to everybody.
Sure.
Talking Central Time.
Yes, he's in Central Time, which is weird because he's in Baltimore. I don't know.
All right. Almost got confused. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's right. I'm being very good. Right. All right.